JonBenet's family now hoping that, plus renewed public interest and new DNA technology, might finally help close this case.
Imagine waking up on the morning after Christmas, the house still warm from the holiday, gifts still sitting under the tree, and the smell of the previous night's celebration still lingering in the air. Now imagine walking downstairs and finding a ransom note, 3 pages long, handwritten, asking for a very specific amount of money, and then discovering that the child you thought was safe upstairs is nowhere to be found. That is exactly what happened to the Ramsey family on December 26, 1996, and what followed was nearly 3 decades of confusion, accusations, broken evidence chains, and unanswered questions that haunted an entire nation. But something has shifted. New technology, new investigators, and a trail of DNA evidence that was always there, waiting to be properly read, may have finally cracked open one of the most talked about unsolved cases in American history. And the more you understand about what actually happened and how badly the investigation was mishandled, the more disturbing the whole story becomes. JonBenet Patricia Ramsey was 6 years old when she was killed. She was the kind of child people remember. Bright, expressive, full of energy. She competed in child beauty pageants and had already won several titles before she turned 7. She attended Boulder's High Peaks Elementary School, where teachers and classmates knew her as curious and friendly. She lived with her parents, John and Patsy Ramsey, and her older brother Burke in a large 3-story home in one of Boulder, Colorado's more comfortable neighborhoods. Her father, John, was the president of Access Graphics, a technology company that had generated close to $1 billion in gross revenue and earned him the title of Entrepreneur of the Year from the Boulder Chamber of Commerce in 1995. From the outside, the Ramsey family looked like the picture of American success. Which is exactly why what happened next felt so impossible to process. On the morning of December 26, Patsy Ramsey came downstairs before anyone else in the house was awake. She found a ransom note sitting on the staircase. It was not a short note. It was approximately 2.5 pages long, which is extremely unusual for a ransom demand. Most ransom notes are brief and direct. This one was elaborate, detailed, and oddly worded. It demanded exactly $118,000, a figure that happened to be very close to John Ramsey's annual bonus from his company. That specific detail immediately raised flags. The note threatened the family and claimed that a small foreign faction was responsible for taking JonBenet. It was signed with the letters SBTC, an abbreviation that investigators, analysts, and amateur sleuths have debated for decades without a definitive answer. Patsy called 911 at around 5:52 in the morning. Police arrived, and what happened in the hours that followed became one of the most widely criticized aspects of the entire case. Because the note suggested a kidnapping rather than a murder, the police did not immediately treat the entire Ramsey home as a crime scene. They secured JonBenet's bedroom but allowed family, friends, and acquaintances to move freely through the rest of the house throughout the morning. People walked through rooms, touched surfaces, sat on furniture, and existed in a space that should have been locked down and preserved from the moment the police arrived. Evidence that might have been crucial was potentially contaminated or destroyed simply because investigators made an early assumption about what kind of crime had taken place. Later that same day, John Ramsey went down to the basement of his home, and he found his daughter's body. She was hidden in a small room that the family used for storage. JonBenet had suffered a skull fracture and had been strangled with a makeshift garrote that was constructed from a cord and a broken piece of a paintbrush handle. The paintbrush handle, investigators later determined, appeared to come from a set of paintbrushes that belonged to Patsy Ramsey. She had been bound, and the official cause of death was asphyxia by strangulation along with a blunt force trauma to her head. She had been placed in the basement, and there was evidence suggesting she may have been moved after she died. John Ramsey picked up his daughter's body and carried her upstairs. This act, while almost certainly driven by grief and shock, destroyed important forensic information. The position of a body at a crime scene tells investigators a great deal about what happened, how the victim was positioned by the perpetrator, and what the circumstances of the death looked like in the moments immediately following it. Once the body was moved, that information was gone. It was one of many moments in this investigation where a critical piece of the puzzle was lost, not through malice, but through a combination of human emotion, poor police protocol, and what many experts later called a fundamental failure to treat the scene with the discipline it required. The investigation that followed was troubled almost from the start. John and Patsy Ramsey were interviewed together rather than separately, which breaks one of the most basic rules of criminal investigation. When potential witnesses or suspects are interviewed together, They have the opportunity to align their accounts, reinforce each other's recollections, and fill in gaps in each other's stories in ways that may not reflect what actually happened. Standard investigative procedure separates people precisely to avoid this. The fact that it was not done in such a high-profile case drew intense criticism from law enforcement professionals for years afterward. Suspicion quickly fell on the family itself. The ransom note referenced an amount tied to John's bonus. The paintbrush came from Patsy's art supplies. Fiber evidence from duct tape used on JonBenet's body reportedly matched fibers from clothing associated with Patsy. There were no signs of a forced break-in at the house. There were no footprints in the snow outside leading to or from the property. Several neighbors reported hearing a scream in the night, though no one called the police at the time. A bowl of pineapple was found on the kitchen counter, and JonBenet's stomach contents at autopsy appeared to include undigested pineapple-like fruit, suggesting she had eaten shortly before she died. Patsy Ramsey's fingerprints were found on the bowl, but both she and John said they had no memory of giving JonBenet pineapple that night. Burke, who was 9 years old at the time, was reportedly asleep when the events unfolded, though investigators found his behavior during subsequent interviews puzzling and difficult to interpret. The media coverage that surrounded the case was relentless and, in many respects, extremely damaging to any real chance of a clean investigation. The Ramsey family was tried in the court of public opinion long before any formal charges were ever considered. Tabloids, television programs, and commentary from armchair analysts turned the case into something closer to entertainment than journalism. Every strange detail was amplified. The beauty pageant footage of JonBenet was played on a loop on television screens across the country. The image of this small, glamorously dressed child competing on stage was framed in ways that raised uncomfortable questions about child pageants while simultaneously making her a symbol of lost innocence. Her story became a cultural moment in a way that made it very difficult for investigators to do their work without enormous public pressure bearing down on every decision they made. Despite all of the focus on the family, the DNA evidence that was collected from JonBenet's clothing told a different story. From very early in the investigation, tiny fragments of DNA were recovered from her clothing that did not match anyone in the Ramsey family. In 1998, initial DNA testing confirmed that the genetic material found on JonBenet belonged to an unknown male. This finding was significant, but at the time, the science of DNA analysis was not advanced enough to do much with a small, degraded sample. The technology simply did not exist to extract a full, usable profile from what had been collected. The DNA sat in evidence storage, a clue waiting for the tools to decode it to be invented. That waiting finally came to an end. In 2024, Boulder law enforcement made the decision to pursue genetic genealogy analysis of the DNA evidence. They partnered with Parabon Nanolabs, a company that has developed expertise in using DNA from crime scenes to reconstruct biological profiles and trace family connections through publicly available genealogy databases. The process works by taking whatever genetic material is available, building the most complete profile possible, and then uploading that profile to databases where members of the public have voluntarily submitted their own DNA to learn about their ancestry. Even if the person responsible for a crime has never submitted their own DNA, there is a reasonable chance that a cousin, a sibling, an aunt or uncle, or some other relative has. Those partial matches can be used to build and narrow family trees until investigators zero in on a specific individual. What the genetic genealogy work revealed was a lead that had never existed before. Following the trail of DNA connections and cross-referencing with public records, birth certificates, marriage records, old employment documentation, and other sources, investigators identified a man who had never previously appeared in the investigation. He was approximately 62 years old in 2024, which would have made him 34 years old at the time of JonBenet's death. He had lived just 2 miles from the Ramsey home in 1996. Critically, he had worked for a catering company that had provided services for events in the Ramsey neighborhood during the Christmas season that year, including a party that took place just a few houses away from the Ramseys' address. His prior criminal record included burglary and fraud. Nothing violent on paper, nothing that would have immediately flagged him as a threat to children, which is likely why he had never come across investigators' radar in the first place. He was not a known associate of the Ramsey family. He was not someone any witness had mentioned. He was simply a man who had been in the neighborhood, who had access to information about the families who lived there, and whose DNA happened to match the genetic material that had been sitting on JonBenet's clothing for nearly 30 years. Investigators confirmed the DNA match by covertly collecting samples the man had discarded, a method that is legally permissible and has been used in numerous cold case investigations over the past decade. The DNA profile extracted from those discarded items was compared to the profile from JonBenet's clothing, and the results were described as a match with an extremely high degree of statistical certainty. Additionally, when investigators executed a search of his property and a storage unit, they reportedly found an old jacket from the mid-1990s whose fibers matched fibers recovered from JonBenet's clothing. Handwriting analysis using modern software tools also identified patterns in the ransom note that corresponded to samples of this man's writing from old employment records. None of this happened in isolation. 9 months after JonBenet's murder, another young girl in Boulder was attacked in her home while she slept. The attacker entered the house quietly, assaulted the child in her bedroom, and fled only when the girl's mother woke up and confronted him. He escaped by jumping off an elevated deck and disappearing into the night. The attack happened just a few blocks from the Ramsey house. The two girls knew each other. They attended the same dance school and had performed together in local productions. Despite these connections, Boulder police did not seriously investigate the possibility that the same person might have been responsible for both crimes. They did not compare DNA evidence from the two scenes. They did not explore the geographic or personal connections between the two cases. And in what became another serious failure of this investigation, the bed sheets from the second girl's bed, which might have contained critical DNA evidence, were eventually discarded. That evidence is gone permanently. The failure to connect these cases is one of the most troubling aspects of the entire story, because in retrospect, the parallels are striking. Both victims were young girls in the same small area of Boulder. Both were attacked in their own homes, at night, while family members were present. Both had connections to performing arts. The attacker in the second incident was described as someone who entered without causing visible damage and who moved through the home with apparent familiarity. If police had pursued that connection rigorously in 1997, it is possible that the investigation might have moved in a very different direction much sooner. Burke Ramsey, who was 9 years old the night his sister died, grew up under a cloud of public suspicion that he never deserved. He spent decades largely avoiding the media, and the silence was frequently interpreted by people who wanted it to mean something sinister. In recent years, Burke has spoken more openly about his experience. He described JonBenet as joyful and full of life, a little girl who made their home feel warmer just by being in it. He talked about what it meant to grow up with the weight of other people's theories about his family pressing down on everything he did. He has been direct about his belief that the investigation was mishandled, agreeing with experts who have long argued that his parents should never have been interviewed together. He supports the use of new forensic technology to re-examine all the available evidence and has expressed hope that the truth will finally be established, not for the sake of his own reputation but for the sake of his sister's memory and his family's long nightmare finally coming to an end. It took until 2008 for the Ramsey family to be formally cleared as suspects by Boulder's district attorney. By that point, JonBenet's mother Patsy had already died of ovarian cancer in 2006, never having seen the cloud of suspicion officially lifted from her name. John Ramsey and Burke have continued to hope that what the new forensic work is uncovering will provide the definitive answer the case has always lacked. Several other names passed through the investigation over the years. A man named Gary Oliva, who had lived near the Ramseys and was later arrested on charges related to child exploitation, made statements after JonBenet's death that raised suspicion, but his DNA did not match the evidence. A man named John Mark Carr gave a detailed and disturbing confession to the murder years later, but it quickly fell apart when investigators established that he had not even been in Colorado at the time, and his DNA also failed to match. A man who had visited the Ramsey home in the weeks before Christmas, dressing as Santa Claus, was discussed as a person of interest for a time, but there was never any physical evidence connecting him to the crime. All of these threads were pursued and discarded, while the actual DNA evidence sat waiting for science to catch up to it. There were also questions raised by some DNA analysts about whether the genetic material on JonBenet's clothing could have been transfer contamination from a factory or packaging environment rather than evidence of contact with an attacker. This theory was given serious consideration and genuinely complicated the picture for a period of time. However, the discovery of consistent DNA traces in multiple locations on the clothing, and the way that those traces match the profile now identified through genetic genealogy, has substantially undermined the contamination theory. DNA experts familiar with the updated analysis have suggested that the pattern and placement of the genetic material is more consistent with direct contact than with incidental factory transfer. What makes this case so enduringly painful is not just that a 6-year-old child was killed in her own home on the night after Christmas. It is the accumulation of failures that prevented her family and the public from getting answers for so long. A crime scene that was not properly secured. Parents interviewed together. A body moved before forensic documentation was complete. Evidence in a parallel case thrown away. Two investigations that should have been connected, never cross-referenced. A media environment that decided who was guilty before the investigation had barely begun. A police department and a district attorney's office that spent years working at cross-purposes rather than in concert. And underneath all of it, a small fragment of DNA that was always there, always pointing toward the truth, waiting for someone to build the tools necessary to follow it home. JonBenet Ramsey deserved better than what the system gave her. Her family spent nearly 30 years living with accusations they did not deserve while the person actually responsible remained unidentified. The work being done now, the genetic genealogy, the re-examination of fiber evidence, the new handwriting analysis, represents the kind of serious, methodical investigation that should have surrounded this case from the very beginning. It cannot undo the years of suffering. It cannot bring JonBenet back. But it may finally do the one thing her family has been asking for since December 1996, which is to tell the truth about what actually happened in that house on the night after Christmas, and to ensure that the person responsible is held accountable. The case of JonBenet Ramsey is not just a true crime story. It is a lesson in what happens when grief is exploited, when investigations are contaminated by assumption, when evidence is mishandled, and when the loudest narrative drowns out the quieter one that is actually true. Nearly 3 decades later, with science finally advanced enough to read what was always written in the evidence, there is reason to believe that the answers are closer than they have ever been. And the more those answers come into focus, the clearer it becomes that the real story is not just a tragedy. It is a systemic failure that compounded a tragedy, and understanding that is part of making sure it never happens again.